All right, hello everyone, and thank you so much for taking time to join us tonight. I'm Trish Kahle, Assistant Professor of History here at Georgetown, and today we are embarking on a series of films that are part of a new project, Cinematic Afterlives, Film and Memory in the Black Atlantic, which is supported by Georgetown University and Qatar's Center for International and Regional Studies. I'm going to start our event tonight by providing a brief introduction of the overall project and tonight's film, as well as introducing you to our discussant, Professor Robert Carson of Texas A&M University at Qatar, and then we'll screen the film and have our discussion. I had organized this series in the hope that through cinema, we can foster in the GUQ and broader Education City community an ongoing discussion about narrating, representing, and engaging the relationship between past and present. I hope that you will join us not only today, but for all of the films in the series. Today, around the Atlantic and the wider world, people are reckoning with what it means to live with history. Perhaps the most visible example of this has been debates over public monuments, acts of what I call radical recontextualization, where protesters change our relationship to history by pulling down monuments to enslavers and colonizers. But films have proven urgent too, sparking sharp debate. How should we remember the past? What is the relationship between our past and our present? How do and should films mediate the relationship between historical production and political imagination? This series itself is the result of such a meditation, of teaching the history of the Atlantic world at a university still reckoning with its ties to slavery, of asking students to engage the work of thinkers and scholars who have imagined and dreamed of Black freedom, while the world around us is replete with mass incarceration, migrant detention, and racist state violence. But historians are not the only ones grappling with such questions. Filmmakers, cast and crew, and audiences are all engaged in the discussion too, at the site where the stakes of narration are peaked. With the film series, we are also looking to broaden our discussions on slavery and its afterlives by putting history, film, and memory in the Black Atlantic in conversations with scholars of slavery and memory in the Indian Ocean and Pacific worlds. A larger growing group of scholars, including Lisa Lowe, Moonho Jung, and Shona Jackson, have all shown us the deep and persistent ties between the enslavement of Africans and other forms of enslavement and unfreedom in the making of the modern world. But this complexity has rarely figured centrally in public memories of these histories. These films are invitations to meditate on the unfulfilled promise of freedom, to place ourselves in an unfolding historical process. The films in this series reflect on how we live with history, and they offer new points of departure for imagining future liberation. The series films, created over the span of half a century on both sides of the Atlantic, reject nationalist freedom myths in search of what scholar Saidiya Hartman has called the fugitive's dream. And with that, let me turn to tonight's film, Tomás Gutiérrez Alea's La Ultima Cena, or in English, The Last Supper, from 1976. Gutiérrez Alea was a Cuban filmmaker and a leader in a movement in Latin American cinema that grappled with political problems facing the region, particularly neocolonialism. This movement was politically engaged cinema, not only for the stories it told, but also for its theory of how cinema changed the people who watched it. Such cinema, Gutiérrez Alea argued, forced the viewer to confront the world that they lived in, to make it visible to them. La Ultima Cena was made in a moment of rebellion and repression across Latin America and the globe. The rebellion and anger that emerged from the disenfranchised and the dispossessed, Gutiérrez Alea argued, had very deep roots, quote, manifestations of the historical relationships between lord and serf, master and slave, boss and subordinate. Rebellion and repression could not be separated from colonialism and its aftermath, and colonialism in Cuba was intimately bound with the enslavement of Africans and the production of sugar, which both feature centrally in tonight's film. Gutiérrez Alea hoped this film would, quote, sow unease in the spectator and touch on aspects of individual and collective conduct that make us think. He hoped the film would stimulate criticism and participation. In that spirit, our community discussion will be led off tonight with comments on the film by Professor Robert Carson. Professor Carson is Assistant Professor of English in the Liberal Arts program at Texas A&M University at Qatar, and his research and criticism have been published in a range of outlets, including the Journal of the Gilded Age and Progressive Era, the Los Angeles Review of Books, and the American Interest.
So what I like to talk about is the function of irony in this film. It's one dimension of the film. There are lots of things one could talk about, but I just want to make a few observations about this particular kind of conceptual device as it works in the film. I think that the main historical agent that Gutierrez Alea is interested in is not the rebel slave or even the master, but the post-emancipation audience. He was a recipient or a beneficiary of the Cuban Institute of Cinematographic Art and Industry, which explicitly identified film as, quote, an instrument of opinion and formation of individual and collective consciousness. So his intentions are openly didactic, and there's nothing surprising in post-revolutionary Cuban cinema exposing colonialism, the Catholic Church, or slavery to withering critique. But I do think there is something remarkable about the way in which this director has done so. I like to trace the way in which the film takes viewers from stable irony to a kind of unstable irony, and from literal contradictions between discourse and reality to figurative contradictions. The first 25 minutes or so of the film suggests that what we're going to see is a slave rebellion as a result of impersonal, inescapable, and easily grasped historical forces. This is set up, I believe, by the kind of the symbolism of the dialogue between the sort of manager, the technician, and the priest when they're talking about witchcraft and purgatory. The technician is able to turn one color of cane extract into another in a kind of gentle mockery of Christ turning water into wine. What was then a miracle is now a kind of chemical magic trick. He talks about the promise of a triple beamed horizontal press, which seems like a kind of coy secularization of the Trinity, the replacement of one technology of domination that is the vertical hierarchy of the church with another kind of domination that is the speedy efficiency of the mill. And then we also have comments about the racial proportions and makeup of the colony, which would suggest that the rebellion, if or when it comes, would be the result of an aggregation of groups in conflict rather than individual ideas or intentions. And certainly in the beginning of the film, religion is ironized in a very immediately graspable way, with the priest's sermon sort of failing to command anyone's attention, his commands that the men wash themselves and the women cover themselves while they're doing laundry before he falls into the river, in a kind of slapstick, botched baptism reversal of roles there. And if these were the only characters in this colony, or the only kind of types that we had, the overseer, the technician, and the priest, then we might have a sort of balance of cruelty and ironic comedy, which could be sustained indefinitely. The main disruptive force in the colony is not any slave, but the count himself. And he starts to destabilize things. I would say the beginning of the destabilization is when he vomits in disgust at the cutting of Sebastian's ear. Right? He's already arranged for the supper to take place, but now he, and in a sense we, begin to think that perhaps a kind of close encounter with the slave population may be more than one can stomach in light of the cruelty that they're subjected to. And this is when the Count's affect really becomes the dominant sort of source of power in this colony. His feelings of disgust, his feelings of shame, pride, sympathy, anger, these feelings become the main kind of historical force in film, or they're what sort of set things in motion, regardless of technology, regardless of religion, regardless of labor discipline, for lack of a better word. And I'll return to this point about affect later. Before getting to the supper, I just want to note, I can't resist this. This film is so richly layered with one ironic reversal after another. We have the Count's homily on the virtues of suffering, which is delivered as a form of indulging himself. His gesture of humility turns into a demonstration of his pride. His magnanimity as a master leads to him almost losing control. There's the staging of the supper itself. In point of historical fact, at the Last Supper of Christ and the disciples, they would have been reclining while eating. By setting a table and having everyone sit in chairs, he's actually reenacting an artistic representation of the Last Supper rather than the Last Supper itself. So he's sort of not quite in control of the narrative there. And then, of course, at the end of the film, we have the slave Sebastian, who's named after a martyr who lives, or would seem to go on living, rather than dying, as a sign of his election, right? So that's another kind of ironic reversal. And then there's the kind of trinity structure of the overseer, the count, and the priest, who one could spend a lot of time mapping the ways in which they displace each other and sort of reconstruct each other's roles in the kind of religious structure that the film operates. And so all of these ironies would suggest that Gutierrez-Alea's didacticism turns on something like critique, that is holding people's actions to the standards of their own professed values, measuring their hypocrisy, right? Which has been called the tribute that vice pays to virtue. However, when we get to the supper itself and the repression of the rebellion, I think a different kind of critical approach appears in the film, which takes certainly a kind of ironic distance from the master and the things he says, but it doesn't turn that ironic distance into a kind of tidy, snappy satire, right? Which so much of the beginning of the film kind of feels satirical. There are three parables told at the supper. First, by the Count on the suffering of St. Francis. In this moment, the audience is, I think, allied with the slaves, and that we are supposed to feel cynical about and be bored, and be sort of bored by the Count's homily. It's delivered, it's supposed to be about the divinity of suffering, but as pure ego gratification. And it's based on a kind of idealism, that is thinking that there are certain transcendent states that people can enter into in order to redeem their souls before God, right? So a kind of high idealism and an almost kind of moral melodrama. So that's the first parable. The second parable is the one by, I think his name is Briemba, his parable of the father, son, and family selling each other. This is directed directly to the camera at first, right? I think it may be the only time in the film where someone sort of looks directly at us. And that has an interesting effect of aligning the audience not only with the slave population, but possibly also with the Count himself in a way, right? It's sort of interesting what happens when he directly addresses the camera and where that places us in this kind of highly theatrical scene that we're in. His parable is, among many other things, a kind of wonderfully virtuosic riff on the Last Supper itself. It scrambles narratives of betrayal, bribery, hopelessness, redemption, and it also figures food as the body of a forsaken, sacrificed man, right? So there's a way in which that parable serves as a retort to the first one about St. Francis. And instead of an idealistic account of the true meaning of suffering, it offers a materialist rejection of that and an identification of the social forces at play before anything like a moral would ever be expressed. Finally, there's Sebastian's parable about the truth wearing the head of the lie. This is told after the Count has passed out, so he's not really listening. So this is purely sort of among the slaves there. And while it places, well, we're back as an audience, sort of back allied with the slaves, there's a weird difference in what the camera does with Sebastian's parable, right? With the previous one, we're looking dead on, but you'll notice that in most of the shots where he's telling that story about truth and lie, sort of becoming fused together. The camera angles are kind of indirect and oblique, and then he actually blocks our view by raising the head of the pig, right? So there's a way in which something different is happening, right? Something different is happening with that parable than the first two. The parable he tells is of a hybrid creature that is a kind of figure or a kind of monster. So we could say that these three parables are three different ways to deploy irony as a kind of didactic, post-emancipatory sort of concept or method or trope. The first one, by the count, is ironized by materiality and is ironized by the film and its direction. The second parable expresses a kind of ironic rejection of the first one. The third parable, about the fusion of truth and lie, is in fact something like a story about irony itself, or about falsehood being born sort of in the sort of, you know, as the head of truth at any given moment, right? So the first one is, you know, subject of irony. The second one is kind of expression of an ironic sensibility. And the third one is something like a creature representing irony itself. And importantly, they're bound together. And there's nothing in the story that suggests that they can ever be taken apart, truth and lie, right? That's the sort of condition that the world operates in after that story. Then after the supper, confusion about truths and lies fuel most of the subsequent action, right? Did the count promise freedom and rest, or didn't he? Likewise, thinking back to that story of the truth and the lie, the question of who has the machete and who gets to keep their head is sort of literally dramatized at the end of the play, right? Where suddenly the body of Sebastian becomes a kind of a foil to the body of lie and truth, except that his is intact, whereas all the other slaves have been separated from them on the pikes around the Cena where they're consecrating the ground. His survival is also figural rather than literal. That is, in talking about how he will survive, he gives us a kind of mythic account of how he will have to turn into a tree or sort of mutate into different natural forces. A similar kind of hybridity or a kind of mutation as the story that he tells about the fusion of truth and lies, right? So we move from sort of like direct ironic commentary to something else where things don't add up to a kind of coherent whole, but nevertheless sort of persist, or at least have the promise of escape from the social system of the colony itself. The rebellion and suppression, I would say, show intentionally the limits of identifying hypocrisy as a lever of critique. Instead of something like critiquing the ideology of slavery, the religious apology for it, we have something like the simple fact of the Count's character and the simple fact of his affect and his mood, which is sort of impervious to critique, right? Even the overseer and the priest, they try to argue with him at different times, and they fail also, right? And in a similar way, the film and sort of implied consciousness behind the film and the kind of implied audience are also not able to really argue with the Count in any productive way. Vincent Canby, when he reviewed this in the New York Times when it came out, said that the Count shows that, quote, the truth of human behavior can never be more than action observed, unquote, which I think is sort of gets at something about the Count as a very, very particular kind of colonial figure who's in one hand, fascinating. The film spends more time with him than anyone else, but also kind of inert, right? There's no real sort of cracking open of what we would call a value system or anything like that. He's sort of a bundle of affects and drives and impulses for which any kind of philosophical justification comes after the fact of whatever it is that he does. It would therefore be wrong to fault the Count for missing the putatively true nature of Christianity or the Last Supper, right? That would be to miss the point and to dehistoricize the church's actual function in this time and place. Religion in this context is not about internal consistency with doctrine, but about outward conformity with ritual. And this is why his reenactment of the Last Supper is certainly a bit much, and one could even say borders on a kind of unintentional camp in the sentimentality with which he approaches it. But it's not meaningfully blasphemous in any way. And it's through inhabiting the religious parable, setting, examining this historical event that supposedly happened during Holy Week, that this film leaves the audience with the sort of material fact of the Count's character as just a material force in the world, rather than an object of critique or ironization, right? So the film sort of like starts with one kind of didactic mode and ends with a very, very different one, which is in fact harder to express at the level of argument. I'd also say that it occurred to me watching it again this time that this film is about the end of a certain type of subtler colonist. That is the kind of aristocratic, exception, person who wants to go to the colonial periphery and be exceptional. In the English tradition, this is all what Joseph Conrad is about, right? That is, you're sort of a nobody in the old world, and you go out to the colonies, and it's there that you can perform a kind of aristocratic largesse that would be ridiculous back home, right? I think the Count is this kind of figure, and what this film gives us is something like the expiration date of that way of doing colonization, that it simply cannot sustain itself given the material demands of what they're all there for. So that's what I have. It's one very particular conceptual avenue into the film. There are many other things that we could talk about, but that's what struck me as how the film's didacticism and schematic construction work.
Well, thank you so much. And so I'll keep an eye on the Q&A. And in the meantime, I think I'll just respond a little bit because it's so, I guess I see so many different points of connection with sort of the historical context that Gutierrez Alea is putting this in, right? So one thing I maybe should have mentioned before the film started, right, is that the Haitian Revolution is happening off screen. And if you sort of get the codes to this, right, or a little bit about the historical timeline, but it's much more implicit, I think, than it might have been, right? He could have, for example, set the film in Haiti itself. But my understanding is that the events did really happen, but sometime in the middle of the 19th century. And so he takes them, recontextualizes them, and then puts in this, character who and for me, is some ways the most difficult to grasp is Don Gaspar, right? So the sugar master, who is, clearly either a white Creole or French refugee from the revolution in Saint-Domingue, and who, sort of fills this sort of crude sort of reformulation of these religious symbols into the sugar mill. But then there's that scene with him at the end that I would love to hear your thoughts on it. I'm not quite sure how to read that scene where Sebastian obviously comes to kill him, and then he's sort of called to answer for how he has survived yet again another insurrection, right? And so there's sort of a lot of meaning left hanging there. But in some ways, right? Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I don't know that it's a kind of savviness, right? Like in a way, of all the sort of enslaving population there, he seems to be the one with the widest view of everything, right? And he's the one who's able to hide, right, and sort of make it out the other end, sort of unharmed. So there's a kind of, and in fact, I mean, that really lights up, why he would have the sensibility to do that if he were, sort of displaced from the Haitian Revolution.
Right. And it also, I think, gets at this idea about how sort of the didactic purpose changes, because it's very evocative of Michel Rothtrio's work, which he's talking about, where the Haitian Revolution makes slave revolution thinkable in a way that it had not before, right? So like someone like the Count, it's not simply that he refuses to see the capacity for historical or political subjectivity in the men that he's enslaving. It's that the historical circumstances he's living in prevents him from seeing it, right? Because it has constructed this world where it's impossible for it to happen. Where Don Gaspar has lived through this event, it is something he can understand and that he can see. And so he's the only one who's able to take that much wider view. We have an attendee who actually asked you to expand on the really interesting point you made about the distinction between the artwork versus the Last Supper as it's actually described. And do you want to sort of just expand on that a bit?
Yeah, the representations of the Last Supper in European art have people sitting at a table, which is not how a feast and Passover week in the time of Christ would have been done, right? It's one of many European artistic adaptations of scripture, of the Gospels, for the purpose of producing devotional imagery, right? And so, and there's a way of thinking about that would identify it as a kind of, as a kind of falsehood, right? Well, you're not really doing the thing that Christ did, right? You're doing the artistic adaptation of the thing that Christ did. And in a certain context, that would be a meaningful criticism to make. But what I think is interesting is that it sort of doesn't matter that much, because the world that we're in this colony is in a sense so unmoored, or sort of so detached from anything like a theological debate or anything like sort of rigorous probing of an aristocrat's religious knowledge or sensibility, right? Like that's just not on the table at all. So in a sense, he gets away with it, right? And then we, as the audience, we get a reenactment of a false artistic adaptation of a scriptural historical event, right? So there are all these layers of mediation, right? And there's a kind of, there's also a kind of theater to it as well, right? Even the way that the shots are framed, right? It's as though they're up on a stage, and we're the audience watching them, right? So everything turns into a spectacle. And you sort of have the feeling that the Count is really doing nothing but watching himself perform in that whole scene.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's really key, right? Is the conscious, not just those moments where I think you were saying Birumbe like looks at the camera, or these moments where you're quite conscious of the viewer's gaze, but that consciousness of audience of all of the characters involved, particularly in that dinner scene, that there's that room for sort of slippage, where you do get those sort of 4 or 5 stories sort of unfolding at one time. We have time probably for 1 or 2 more questions. If anyone else wants to go ahead and submit into the Q&A. I guess while we wait for that, I had one more that I sort of wanted to hear you say a little bit more about, because it was really fascinating to me, which was sort of that idea about the limits of hypocrisy as critique. Right, which is really evocative of Priya Satya's recent work talking about, the inability of people to see themselves as hypocrites, and so the limits of sort of explanation from a historical sense. But I was wondering if you can talk about it more in sort of in the context of somewhere you have such incredible disparities of power in sort of the different narrative actors, how that might sort of shape the way we think about sort of how hypocrisy functions in the story. And then we also have a question about the original release and reception of the film as well, which we can, you can take, or I can also add to as well.
I think you might speak with more authority about that than I would, but I mean, in my view, the power of hypocrisy as a thing to identify critically with any kind of political momentum is a thing that would separate our moment from the moment depicted in the film, right? And I think and so I actually would want to sort of put the brakes on drawing too many kind of present parallels with the film. That is that the world we're in there is one of aristocratic privilege, right? There's no pretense of democracy. If there's no pretense of democracy, then you can't fault anyone for not being democratic, right? And I think that's a fundamentally different kind of ideological space than what we're in now, where in a sense any kind of appeal for justice that one wants to make must sooner or later appeal to the professed values of the people who are dominating you, right? Now you can see that as a sort of selling out, or as a kind of, you know, sort of liberalism, right? But even when it's disavowed, right, it inevitably comes back, you know, where the claim that you're making is you're not living up to the ideals that you profess to hold. And I just don't think that this film is in that kind of world at all, which is what I think is really strange about it, right? We think we're going to get into, you know, the complex ambivalence and the sort of divided conscience of the master, and we don't, right? We don't. He just responds one way to one thing and another way to another thing.
Yeah, I guess the other side though is I sort of see it as that there's also a sort of walking the viewer through where you, again, because so much time is spent with the Count, we think he's the central character, right? Because that's sort of the way we're used to seeing stories told. But I think at the end, right, like he's really walking us through sort of seeing the subjectivity of the other men at the table, right? And you gradually see more and more that like the Count himself, you're only, well, not only, that would be, I think that overflattens him as well, but that you're viewing him almost through the sort of the lens of the other enslaved men at the table. And there's sort of a moment that happens. And I think there's also this sort of, the way that the script about lie and truth is sort of the moment that becomes really, really apparent, right? It sort of hints, and then that's the moment which the narrative turns. And so we have just these last two maybe to finish up. So the question about the reception of the film, and then also this question about, you know, how to read the Yoruba tradition in this purely Christian setting, and that did this lead to slaves thinking about rebelling. And then another about, yes, obviously didn't pass the Bechdel test, but fortunately we have Daughters of the Dust next, which puts a much more central role on women. But how do you think the role of women as slaves and owners could have been brought into the film in a substantive way, or could they not have been included in this film because of the Last Supper focus?
Ooh, that's really interesting. That's really interesting. I mean, the moment you put it in a Last Supper focus, it just sort of is a kind of exclusively male sort of paradigm and set of references, right? Yeah, I mean, the only real presence of a woman figure in the film is of a kind of a collateral damage, right? In this conflict. I don't know. I mean, I think in a way, I think that's a consequence of making a film routed through this set of historical touchstones, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's also interesting though, because I think even just highlighting sort of the absence of women's narratives, and it does also just highlight the importance of masculinity, right, to the narrative. So even where we might not have sort of a full sense of women's participation, even though we do get hints from Don Manuel screaming out to his wife, right, to tell the Count what has happened, right, of her complicity with the system and her participation in it, that we also get a sense about what it means to make a whole man, right, at the film, and sort of Sebastian, by sort of merging into the maroon ecology, right, of the maroon society up in the hills, right, sort of becoming a full person that he was denied on the plantation. I mean, I could say much more historically about sort of the role of women in slavery, but I want to make sure to give you the last word, since you're our guest.
I'm sure I sort of want to defer to what you would say about that. I mean, the film doesn't really give us much to hold on to in terms of what Sebastian's escape consists of, right? So that would have to be a kind of something that that the director is assuming certain knowledge on the part of the audience, which which if you don't know about, makes the ending seem sort of implausible. But then if you do know about it, then the kind of metaphorical mythic metamorphosis into different kinds of natural objects, actually has a kind of momentum to it, right? Yeah. About masculinity, I think it's interesting that the count arrives quite fussy and foppish, right? And at the end of it, he sort of, I think there is a kind of masculinization process that happens there, right? Where he suddenly is no longer permitting himself to indulge in what could be coded as sort of feminine sympathy, impulses towards sympathy, right? And in a way, I mean, also the loss of the wig, right? Is a major turning point in what counts as a form of masculine deportment, right? Where that goes from being sort of normal to being kind of ridiculous, right? And the piece of the event colony is the time in which that becomes ridiculous, right? You can't be like that anymore after you have this kind of uprising. It just won't work, right? He becomes much closer to the overseer in a sort of style and component.
Right, which in some ways,
that's all I have.
Yeah, no, I think in some ways that reflects, right, Tyler Stovall's recent work on the idea of white freedom and Black freedom as sort of being different. And you can see that happening in obviously a very gendered way, right, where it's sort of the Count's idea of masculinity and domination sort of appears in one way, and that's directly counterposed to Sebastian's ability to flee into the hills. I would say, just for our audience, if you come back for the next couple of films, is that a lot of the imagery that appears in this film will also appear in the others in places where there is much more direct engagement with issues of gender, less on the part of women doing the enslaving, but rather on the part of enslaved women. If you're interested in the history of the role of women in enslaving people of African descent, particularly in the United States, I really recommend Stephanie Jones Rogers' They Were Her Property, which does a much better job of sort of, not sort of putting women on the side, but really centering them in the history of how enslavement was perpetrated and perpetuated in the United States. But with that, we are over time. So I will just thank you again so much for your time this night, tonight, and for some really wonderful comments that gave me some new ways to think about this film. And I hope everyone else was able to enjoy this as well, and that we will see you back here on February 1st for Daughters of the Dust, which is truly an absolutely incredible film. Both it's just a cinematic masterpiece as well as a really rich historical text. And I hope you'll join us again.
Thank you very much.